Bom dia, boa tarde a
Good
todos.
morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first webinar of the EDLC. We're going to have translation in Portuguese, Spanish, and English, and you can choose the language that you have chosen before. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our first webinar of our Environmental Defender Law Center. We're going to have presentations in Portuguese and in Spanish and simultaneous translation into Portuguese, Spanish, and English, depending on the link that you have chosen.
We will have presentations in Portuguese and Spanish and simultaneous translation into Portuguese, Spanish, and English according to the link you have selected. Posto esta nota técnica, vamos dar início ao webinar. O meu nome é Margarida Ravara e trabalho como Staff Attorney no Environmental Defender Law Center. Sou licenciada em Direito pela Faculdade de Lisboa e mestre em Direitos Humanos pela Faculdade de
For
Lund
the
na Suécia.
university in Sweden, coincidentally, my master thesis was on plastics and strategic litigation. So I'm especially excited to welcome you to this webinar entitled The Impacts of Waste Contamination on the Environmental and Human Rights, and specifically the case of single-use plastics. This webinar is being held in collaboration with two NGOs, Institute of Collective Law, IDC, our Brazilian partner, and Colectiva Malditos Plásticos, our Mexican partner, who will be presenting below and whom I'd like to thank you in advance for their collaboration. In the person of their president, today's webinar, we will show contamination by waste, particularly those that are single-use plastics, and the negative impacts on the environment and human rights, namely the right to the environment and the right to health. This will be illustrated by two cases that will be presented by our NGO partner that will demonstrate how strategic litigation can be instrumental in enforcing laws that would otherwise not get off the ground. First, the IDC will present the case concerning reverse logistic legislation in the state of Rio de Janeiro. This case highlights how waste contamination leads to a large disproportion in the lives of those who handle these materials and are exposed to their contaminants, such as recyclers. Consequently, it emphasizes the importance of measuring these impacts, that assigning responsibility to waste generators. The Malditos Plásticos Coalition will then present its case that shows how strategic litigation can also be instrumental in forcing the legislative power to act when it's silent on constitutional rights, such as the right to a healthy environment. Our aim with this webinar of the IDC and the collective, it's to start the discussion, and then you can send your questions in the YouTube chat. Our main objective with this webinar is to offer a stage for these two NGOs, coalitions, so they can inspire, can be published in other places as well. Most materials that are strategic used human rights in the environment are in English. EDLC felt that needs to start its own webinars with interventions in Portuguese and Spanish. For this reason, today's speakers will speak in these two languages, as well as all the materials that have been produced in support of this webinar and which we'll make available on our website. We are going to listen to the EDLC Executive Director, Fernanda Vinzon, who I shall give the floor right now. Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you, Margarida, for starting today's event. It's great to be part of today's event in today's webinar. For this first webinar that we are organizing together with the EDLC and the collective Malditos Plásticos and IDC. It's very relevant for everybody, just as Margarida has said that have studied this subject in her master degree. I also have some experience related to the waste. In the beginning of the year 2000, I was in charge for the implementation the waste management plan at Curitiba Airport in Brazil, in the south of Brazil. That's where I've been living now, and where we have the EDLC office today. Well, I have started for a year, but I have been working for the EDLC for 15 years. We are an organization that are NGO, non-government organization. Well, what we felt that at the EDLC is that we have to publicize, as Margarita has said, inspiring initiatives about the subject of waste. It brings up in myself lots of mixed emotions. The emotion that I feel most of the time is a kind of uneasiness, restlessness, because the fact that we live in a place, environment that is filled with waste, plastics, and other wastes that come from oil, and if this was something kind of normal. And I feel this restlessness or uneasiness because I know that things could be very different. I'm 55 years old, and I vividly remember in my childhood when drinks were sold in glass bottles and supermarkets packages. They were also used cardboard. Today, this is kind of a luxury that we see in countries like Luxembourg and other European countries, but in Brazil and other countries of the global south, what we observe most of the times, the package is made out of plastic. I remember very well when PET bottles they were launched in Brazil. There was an advertisement that showed bottles that were being thrown down the stairs, and people said that it was a perfect bottle because it did not break. Today, I feel horrified, appalled by that kind of advertisement campaign and all the consequences that it has brought about in the production of plastics since that time. Also, I feel deep sadness because I know that today microplastics, they are everywhere inside our bodies, in our body, blood, in our brain. I've read something yesterday in The Guardian that said that microplastics they are found in brains because there are post-mortem tests. They are in our blood, in our breast milk. And I'm quite saddened by the way our societies they treat people that sort and recycle waste. These people on those shoulders, the companies that manufacture and use and recycle waste, how they feel about that, and those that should be in charge of the recycling, also the consumers. We are all part of this problem. In the world, only 90% of plastic waste is recycled. Despite all of that, companies do not say about reducing the amount of plastic they generate. Now, after much pressure, they're talking about preventing plastic from reaching the oceans. But not only has plastic already reached the oceans, but it's already in the stomachs of marine animals. There are islands of plastic waste in the oceans as well. In short, in a few decades, plastic, when they started showing case about PET bottles, saying that it was perfect, the plastic today is no longer a cheap packaging. Today, it's something omnipresent. It's all over the place. I would dare to say that plastic is part of our food chain, but unfortunately that's the case. And how did we get to this point? I think that we have failed to demand the approval of a proper legislation and also failed to demand the implementation of existing legislation. The cases presented below from Rio de Janeiro and Mexico, they are clear examples of how to overcome these shortcomings. They are examples of inspiring initiatives for all of us. As you watch the presentations, I'd like to invite you to think, to ponder on how these initiatives can be strengthened or replicated. I hope you enjoy today's webinar. Thank you very much. Thank you, Fernanda. Now, I give the floor for the head of the Collective Law Institute. Thank you very much, Margarita. Her name is Tatiana Bastos from IDC. I represent the Institute of Collective Right. It's great to be talking to you. I'm going to give you an audio description. I am a white woman. I'm 43 years old. I'm not wearing glasses, and I'm wearing a gray t-shirt. I'm going to share my presentation with you, and I'm here open for answering your questions as well. If you could tell me if you can see my presentation in front of you. Is it okay? Is it okay for everybody? Can you all see the presentation? Great, thank you. I'd like to talk about the importance of legal remedies in cases of environmental contamination from the Collective Rights Institute. We are also part of the civil society, NGO. We are working to give support of rights, and the focus is social justice. We have a network of more than 120 entities that we offer services in 5 states of Brazil and other municipalities. We work regionally, nationwide, and we are focusing today to strive for social justice through these 3 axes, that is strengthening democracy, also environment, and in social inclusion. I have 2 cases, 2 sources that we are acting today. The first is judicially. It was an action that was proposed for the 4th year of the action that we have been conducting. The justice, unfortunately, is an excellent tool, but it takes too long to deliver the outcomes. Also, having evidences, we have to raise information that we have done that in the state of Rio de Janeiro. Of the change of the legislation in the state of Rio de Janeiro, there are people that do not live in Brazil, maybe do not know how we are legally structured. We have 27 states. The Brazilian legislation is federal-wide and also state and city legislations. The national policy on solid waste, it was approved in 2010. We are going to the 15th year of these national policies, and in the state of Rio de Janeiro, the state law of it's from 2008. So we are working together. It's a specific legislation on the reverse logistic in the state of Rio de Janeiro that is somehow more progressive than the one in Brazil. We expect a more united legislation because sometimes the states and cities, they have the possibilities of using anything related to the environment or to apply legislation in the states and cities. Also, it's important to talk about what we do. We have raised information We have mapped actually those that are obliged in the marketplaces, because this legislation, these laws, they rule the reverse logistic in packaging, generally speaking, as a means of what this information, this survey that we have conducted. We have conducted an assessment. What happens, how we consume these materials. After raising this information, we found that most of those that were in the shelves, in the supermarkets, they did not present a plan on how they would plan and how they would use the packages that are placed in the marketplace or in the markets, in the shelves, with this information, using the public sphere, public power, and we observe that there is an absence of data. It's quite opaque, the information that comes to us. It's important to have evidences to showcase what we're doing. An observation, a previous evidence of those that are obliged to offer this information, and also lack of data sent by the public sphere. And they keep on doing that. The request is that we ask for the INEA, for all these agencies to have access to the data, and where are the plannings that are that that they wanted to withdraw from the environment. The packaging, a sea of packages. It's not only plastic packagings, but all sorts of packagings. But we know how it is impactful of plastic in the environment. Despite all of that, having access to data and the effectiveness of the reverse logistics, we wanted to, having this survey, we wanted to know the effectiveness on how the waste pickers is foreseen in the Brazilian policies of solid waste. So we wanted to have the evidences on all these aspects that I have mentioned before. The state law in the state of Rio de Janeiro, it expands, it's broader, those that are obliged to the financing, those that have to plan how they're going to use these packages, because they say those that are polluters, they have to use for products that are consumed in the state of Rio de Janeiro, either produced or they are traded in the state of Rio de Janeiro. What is the impact of all of that? Is not only to be produced in the Rio de Janeiro. If the product, if that package, if it's packed in Rio de Janeiro, and where the residue or the waste is going to stay after the consumption of that product, it's going to be somehow thrown away in that place. It should have the consent and the planning for that, to discharge that, and those that are obliged can be importers, traders, not only those that produce packages for products that will be a package afterwards. That's a challenge that we face, to be able to map those that are obliged to do that. The legal entity can be outside Brazil and send and sell the products in the state of Rio de Janeiro. After facing these difficulties, the public power feels the need of the information of the quantitative products that are traded in the state of Rio de Janeiro. What are the companies that supply these products, for example? And sometimes they show ineffectiveness in the state of Rio de Janeiro. The Institute of Collective Right, we have as a principle our pillars. The reason why we exist is to make it more make it more practical, because it's a very guaranteistic legislation, of course, with some needs to be improved, as most having the participation of the societies, for example, because it would help our work as well. The way that it was written enables some gaps. The reason why we exist is the principle that we exist, those that we want to apply the law for in practice. That's what we need to do today. We should have more evidences today. It has this challenge. We face this difficulty. We want to raise data so we are able, at the end of the action, observe the main those that are not abide by the law, the companies that either did not declare what they're doing, but they are obliged, but they do not meet or abide by the law, to be, for example, transparent, to plan, to communicate, the reverse logistics of their packages, or sometimes they planned, they showed they planned, and they do not abide by the laws. Maybe they offer false data that do not help that 22% of the proper destination of the packages in the state of Rio de Janeiro. This evidence action that we are conducting, it has
baixa utilização, na verdade, no
it's
mundo
very
jurídico,
little used legally, mainly because people do not know this legislation, but also there is not an obligation of the participation of the state attorney following up the national legislation. The absence of following up of the public attorney that we have faced today, difficulties to really have the advocacy together to the attorney's office in Brazil, in the proper court in Brazil, to show the importance that is having access to data in the logistic reverse system today. And what happens with the public sphere that this sphere does if they do not acknowledge all this data, all this information that we offer? We should have an action. They answered positively, they are following the actions, but the outcome of this proposition, despite the time that we are following, moving to the fourth year of this action, lots of things have been publicized about the system of logistic reverse. Also, there is a legislation that abides to that. We know the legislation, but it's very much beyond the needs that we have today, and mainly to have effectiveness in the Brazilian legislation in the state of Rio de Janeiro. The conclusion is specifically about the first action, that we observe a low effectiveness of the surveillance of the public sphere. We also do not have proper evidence, and also do not have the mandatory participation of this public attorney. And we have to think about strategies to be closer to the public attorney, also agencies to control this, all of that. Also those that should be abided to that. The public power should use this lack of data that is happening now in the state of Rio de Janeiro. They do not follow, and they say that there is a justification to not follow this information. There is a sort of resistance to monitor that socially, and also the public sphere brings this idea to protecting the market, not to share the company's share, There are lots of discussion about that, but should be more transparent publicly because packages, they are responsible for the impact that we are suffering in the environment, mainly regarding the waste. Today, when we go to the judiciary power, it takes too long. It's the fourth year of this action that we have proposed, and it's a challenge both for civil society to follow the actions that take too long, and also this feeling that we have of impunity, the law that doesn't work. That's what we call this way of doing things, that maybe it becomes a reality in the judiciary sphere. In this aspect, I'm talking about it nationwide. So these are the challenges that we have faced in these actions, and that we are working strongly to move on. Then, coming to the second case,
os colegas, enfim, que eu também quero muito
I
ouvir.
really would like to hear you guys, to have your remarks, to listen to the collective. We have raised some information in the state of Rio de Janeiro together with the Federal University of the state, having the support of Gaia and Breakthrough from Plastic, having an editorial that we received, and we are talking about the role recyclability of plastic and the impact of the waste pickers in Brazil. For public that are not from Brazil, we have, for example, waste pickers, not all over the world. In Brazil, we have professionals. Maybe they're part of unions, cooperatives, or having a collective participation, maybe individual as well. These people, they will sort out the waste, and many times they benefit part of these materials in this recycling process. However, there are professionals that unfortunately many times they are in the landfills, controlled landfills. They are acting in very high vulnerable situations. Our Institute of Legal Rights, we look into that as well. We want to protect the professionals that are waste pickers. In our research, we have raised or worked research in 20 cooperatives of garbage pickers in Brazil, in 9 cities in Brazil. We used waste samples to measure the rates of plastic and in the wastes of these cooperatives that we are studying. We also weighed the materials, we quantified, we sorted them out, all these wastes, to analyze the materials. And one of the things that we wanted to deliver, we also had the brand auditings of those plastics, both plastics that are recyclable and also plastics that are waste, that they should be sent to landfills, or unfortunately sometimes they are sent to landfills, large landfills in the state of Rio de Janeiro. What did we discover about that? What were our main findings in our report that will be published tomorrow? We will publish in our website tomorrow this report, the whole report, the assessment with the methodologies, with all the attachments. But I decided to have these main findings. The first one is that the waste, they represent 16%. Oh, I'm going to repeat myself. In that measurement, the plastics, they represent 16% of the wastes that are collected by these waste pickers in Brazil. The plastic, they represent 60% of what is thrown away, that is not possible to be used by the unions of these garbage pickers. They do not offer any revenue, any income for those people. There is a high volume of 16% of plastic, but at the end of the day, there is a waste somehow that is very important, very meaningful for the cooperatives of waste pickers. Because of that, these waste pickers, they handle this material, they handle this plastic that can cause problems to their health. The machinery as well can be impacted because a plastic get caught in this machinery that they use sometimes. There is a potential to reduce the income of this union, and also lack of information that they have. Some packages, they do not have the information of being possible to be recyclable in that packaging as well. It's important to have more transparency. It's important to abide by the Brazilian legislation in Brazil, and also to follow up what is happening to the packagings in Brazil. Well, we need to have more information, the challenge that we face in the Brazilian policy of solid waste. Without data, it's impossible to conduct policies in Brazil, not only proofs that we have, but also the study that we have conducted that show to organize the importance of mobilization to reduce the plastic that are difficult to be recycled or impossible to be recyclable, and strengthening the unions that we have in Brazil. The state surveillance is important in Brazil, and there is not an effective responsibilization for the company that should be obliged to do something about the low rate of recyclability of plastic in the unions. Sometimes they do not have the possibility to be recycled. However, there is not a movement that this kind of waste is not used in the consumption, generally speaking. So this is my contact. I apologize for speaking too much, and then I'm available if you need more information.
Muito obrigada, Tatiana.
Thank you
Agora,
very
cedo a
much,
palavra a Larissa Dior, de la colectiva
Tatiana.
Malditos
Now I'm gonna
Plásticos.
give the floor to Tatiana from Colectiva Malditos Plásticos.
Gracias.
Thank you very much. I'm gonna share my screen with you.
¿Estamos bien?
Can you all see my presentation?
Muy bien.
Thank you. We live in a historic moment today, the discussion about the plastics and how it impacts on the environment and human health in a global conversation. My name is Alan Castrito. I'm speaking from Mexico. This collective movement is located in Mexico and talks about the colonialism of garbage, environmental injustice. It's important that we have a perspective of the problem of the contamination by plastic, especially having the scientific research that shows the face that is very different on the use of plastic. It's very important that plastics are considered not only in the moment that they are used or they are transformed in waste. There is also lots of steps that should be given before and after that needs the attention of the whole world. We know that plastics when they are
combustible o como
waste,
combustible alterno en
they
procesos
are
de
used as
incineración por
fuel,
obtención de energía.
alternative
También históricamente,
fuels
la
for
disposición de los
example,
residuos
incineration
sólidos
to obtain more
en
energy,
tierra, como en los
also
basureros,
the
etcétera.
way that they are
O también un tema que hemos
thrown
seguido
away
desde
in
la
the
perspectiva
landfills
lo
as
que es
well. We have to think
la
about that.
economía
There
de
is
los
another
residuos
point that we
plásticos a
follow
nivel
up in
global,
this our
donde se
coalition
exportan
is how the
residuos a países con
plastic waste are
legislaciones
used.
más
There is the export of
desfavorecidas.
plastics for
E incluso
countries
antes de ser
with legislations that are not good
una
enough.
botella o un
Before
envase, tenemos el proceso de la
being a
extracción de los
bottle,
hidrocarburos. Si
there is a
durante la extracción
process of
se
extracting these
abusan del
other
sistema
carbons.
y se
Before
contamina
that,
agua, suelo y aire. No
there is
obstante,
also
también
the
el
abuse
proceso de
of
la
water
producción,
in
que es
systems
donde
that are
se
contaminated.
vierten más de
Despite all of that,
4.200 químicos para
we have
poderle dar
more than
esas
4,200
cualidades
chemical
que se
products
ofrecen como
that enable the qualities that are
artículos
offered
buenos y
in
útiles.
these packagings,
La
such
exposición que
that should be
tenemos,
good and useful. The exposure that we have to these materials,
la exposición que tenemos es muy amplia. En esta imagen les puedo mostrar
the
que de esas
exposure
cuatro
that we
etapas, por
have
ejemplo,
is
la
very
extracción, el
broad.
transporte,
In this
la
image, you can see
refrigeración y la
here 4
fabricación,
stages:
el uso, el consumo y el
extraction,
desecho. Tenemos
manufacturing,
una serie de
use,
exposiciones
consumption,
químicas de
and
alta
discharging
preocupación
it.
y que
There are
van desde
lots of
la
chemical
inhalación
exposures
de
that are very
diferentes
worrisome,
químicos,
since the
como también la
inhalation of
ingestión
chemical
de
products,
aire y agua
as well
contaminados.
as the ingestion by
Eh,
air or
Durante todos estos
contaminated water.
procesos de
Along
exposición
these
tenemos también
processes
exposición
of
a sustancias
exposure,
sumamente
we also
problemáticas que
have
son
the
cancerígenas, que tienen
exposure to
persistencia y que se
highly,
bioacumulan y que
highly
además tienen la
harmful
capacidad
substances
de ser
that they
móviles
are
y
bioaccumulative, that
permanecen en el entorno.
sometimes they can be
Entonces, con esto
mobile
lo
or
que
that
quiero
they
yo decir es
might
que
remain in the
durante
environment. I'd
toda
like
su
to say
existencia
that
y durante
along
su gestación como un producto
along the
plástico,
existence of
tenemos
these
infinidad de
materials
detalles que
and the way that these
obligan a
plastics
pensar y
are
repensar
produced,
qué es lo
there
que
are
hacemos
lots of
con el
details
plástico
that
y
we
si
have to
queremos como
think and
humanidad
rethink
seguirlo
what we do with
utilizando y
plastics.
abusando.
And if we
Las
want
sustancias
to be, as
tóxicas
mankind,
contenidas en los plásticos
keep on using this
generan
kind of
cáncer,
components,
cambios en el
these
ADN y
chemical
son disruptores
substances that are in these
endógenos, es decir,
materials,
en el
they
balance
generate
hormonal.
cancer,
Aquí
changes
muy
in
rápido
the
podemos
DNA,
mostrarles que
they can
los
cause
plásticos
changes in the
contienen más de
hormones, also
16.000
alterations in the
sustancias
hormones.
químicas.
There are more than
De esas
16,000
sustancias, el
chemical
26%
substances, and
ya
amongst
se
these
tiene
substances,
clasificado como
26%,
sustancias peligrosas.
they were
El resto pueden
classified
ser no
as
tan peligrosas
harmful
o, por ejemplo, el
substances.
17%
Maybe
de
other,
16 son
they are not so
sustancias de
harmful,
las que
and
no se
some of the
conoce
substances,
su
they
peligrosidad.
are
Que
highly
no se
harmful,
conozcan no
and some of
significa que sean
these
inocentes. Estas
substances, they do
sustancias
not
entonces
know
son
if they are
utilizadas para
harmful or
darle las
not,
propiedades
if they are
como
hazardous or
colorantes,
not, and
lubricantes,
lots of the
agentes
substances that are used to
clasificadores,
offer the
etcétera.
properties, colors for
Eh,
these plasticizers,
Nosotros en este
etc., etc.
momento, estando
Transparency, for
ante una
example,
situación
being
donde
one of these
incluso
characteristics,
todas
we are
las
facing
etapas
a
donde el
situation
humano está en contacto, no nada más
that
el
all the
consumidor,
stages
sino
in which
la
human
gente
beings
que
are in
manipula
contact,
estos
not only
materiales.
consumers,
Desde
but
la
those that
perspectiva de la
manipulate
colectiva
this
Malditos
material, that
Plásticos,
handle these
nos preocupa
materials.
también este uso de la información
We
como una
from
falsa
this
solución. Hay que tener
collectiva,
muchísimo cuidado.
we want to
En este
find an
momento entra
information.
entonces estos
Sometimes we have a
documentos
false
tan
solution right
innovadores y
now.
tan potentes
We
como
do have these
el de
documents
Bascu Tunca,
that
que es
bring
el
about
Relatores
this, that
Sociales de
shed
Sustancias
lights on
Tóxicas
the
de Naciones
subject.
Unidas, donde por
We
primera
have a
vez
Bastung Tunca.
señala el
It's
deber
a
del
person
Estado
from the
de
human rights
prevenir
that
la
indicates
exposición a
the right of
sustancias
the
tóxicas.
state to offer
Menciona la
the
falta de
exposure
regulación
to
de medidas
toxic
precautorias y
substances.
sobre todo
Basku Tonka, he
de
talks
respetuoso
about
con los
the
derechos humanos.
precautions, the measures
Las
that should be
sustancias
taken that
peligrosas
should
perpetúan
respect
la
human rights.
discriminación y
These
precisamente
hazardous
afectan la
substances,
vida y la salud,
they perpetuate
especialmente de
the
grupos
discrimination
vulnerables.
and affect
De
the
igual
health
forma,
and
Marcos
health and
Orellana,
life of very
relator
vulnerable
de
groups.
tóxicos, menciona
Marcos
entonces
Aureliana,
que
he is a
es
reportee of toxic
importante subrayar
materials.
el
He talks
derecho a la
about the
información sobre
importance
los
to
peligros de los
highlight
plásticos,
the
la
right to
rendición de
information
cuentas
about the
y
dangers that are
precisamente
presented by plastic
retomar
and should
medidas
render
urgentes
accounts exactly talks about very urgent measures to control the production and use of plastics in an agreement that were conducted worldwide and legally
desde el inicio la producción de estas sustancias tóxicas.
that should talk about the production of these toxic materials. As I had said before, the plastics, they affect the most vulnerable groups in the societies. In this picture here, you can see the presence of material, plastic material, in the case of composting, recycling materials in Mexico City. It's a kind of a mill. They are finalized goods, organic wastes that are processed, in which the presence of the plastic material is undoubtedly present. We have an example here, a terrible example, that despite that there is a place, a facility that says that is managing the solid waste, they only offer a sample that this kind of plastic wastes, they are terrible, they are all over the place. We are much closer to these materials than we could ever imagine. There is another image here. Then I will give the floor to my colleagues that will keep on talking about this material. Well, Jose Manuel and we are going to talk about toxic colonialism and environmental racism. And then after that, we are going to invite our attorney to talk about the case, what we have done, the advances, the success about the situation. Firstly, I'd like to say that one of the products of this coalition was a platform of the colonialism of plastic in Mexico. That's here we have a story map that is an X-ray about this colonialism, about environmental racism and everything that is coming to Mexico. All the wastes, plastic wastes that are closed. The borders in China were closed, in Thailand, for example, and let's see how much garbage waste is going to reach us. Some of the content of our platform are these. You can check it out in our website. You can have access to all these articles. You can check it out, the volumes that reach Mexico coming from the United States. We have information, we have statistics about the exports and imports. What are the ports that are involved in this material that come to Mexico? Also, there is the incineration of plastic in Mexico. Recycling in Mexico, they are not really recyclable. 90% they are toxic, so they're not possible to be recyclable. We have, for example, cases of Oaxaca. There is another company, Direct Pack in Mexicali, other industries of cement. All of that shows that this double standards, this greenwashing, this false solution that says that recycling is a solution, but in reality, recycling, these words are used by the government, by the industries to insert these wastes in the incineration process. We cannot burn hydrocarbonates because they create chemical and toxic substances and say that this is a recycling process, that is a plastic neutrality. I'm gonna give the floor to Jose Manuel. He's going to talk about what is happening now, our findings, problems related to the findings, information that we have. And the person that are here today in this webinar should know that closing the border of China have increased 101% these plastics in Brazil. They are reaching Mexico. They are burned in the cement industry from 20 2015 to 2021, we have imported more than 620,000 billion of kilos of plastic. 99% are coming from the United States. Well, we're not going to offer more data because in this webinar, we want to talk about the legal actions that we're taking both in Brazil and Mexico facing this contamination and what we call also environmental racism. So, Jose Manuel, you have the mic. Let's keep on with the presentation. I'm going to show you these graphs we have created with official data from the US and also from the Mexican government. In the blue line, the one that is at the top, there are some words, SIAV INEGI. That's what the government accepts officially, that they accept that these materials are entering Mexico. So we had before 56 tons coming today to roughly more than 200 tons in 2023. In 2021, there are lots of organizations that wanted to somehow curb this kind of situations. In spite of reducing or decreasing the amount of plastic, it actually increased. The government from the United States, they received all this plastic. What the government from the United States says that has sent to Mexico has risen from 23 to 70,000 in the same period from 2015 to 2023. Okay, so officially the US never has sent more than 100,000 tons of these plastic wastes to Mexico, according to North American government. There is a huge difference of 500,000 tons of plastic wastes that should be in some place in Mexico. We have doubts about that. We don't have the information about that. As it was said before, the colleagues from Brazil and those that are speaking here from Mexico, there are lots of narratives about that, but the governments, they still very permissive. We are still a colony. We are very passive in corruption. We also have a specific case of a company that should treat their wastes without any kind of authorization from the Mexico government. These are very complex situations. For a long time, it has been the case. I would like to highlight some points that are proposed, some recommendations, but I think that one of the most important ones today are the ones that are being dealt with in the what we call Plastic International. If in this treaty, there is not an obligation to reduce the production of plastics, we are going to keep on managing the disgrace, and we're going to keep on listening the governments and companies saying that the circular economy, the plastic neutrality, for example, talking about recycling effectiveness. Actually, this recycling of chemicals, they are prone to cause cancer. What are going to keep on receiving, we will tackling the consequences without destroying the root cause. Having these recommendations, they are going to remain here, and then I'm going to offer these documents for you. Thank you very much. So, Luis Miguel, you have the floor now. Thank you very much, all those that are here today. Also, thank you for interest in listening to me. And it's important to talk about the action, this litigation that was adapted in Mexico to advance in to forbid the use of single-use plastics. the single-use plastics, when they are produced, they are very impactful on human rights. They were manufactured to be toxic wastes and hazardous. Despite all of that, the recommendations of the UN, what is recommended, what is preached, we should prevent the exposure to these materials. Despite that, governments and corporations, they are not able to fight for this, to forbid this material. I'm going to comment this case and our experiences to this case. In Mexico, to forbid these single-use plastics, I think we can start talking about the year of 2022 in August 22, 17th of August, to talk about the Supreme Court. They made a decision that has supported companies against the prohibition of plastics of single use in one of the states that we call, that is named Oaxaca. You know that Mexico is a federation formed by 22 states that are distributed with different responsibilities according to the constitution. The federation has specific competences, and what is not of responsible of the federation is the states should be responsible for that. The municipalities, we should have an organization that is closer to people. They were forbid to use plastics. The companies, they had an action, a lawsuit, and have taken this action to the Supreme Court that was supported. These companies, they were supported, that said that it was the competence of the states, the possibility of forbid the use of single use. Only the Congress, federal Congress, because there is a federal law about waste, in which we have invested the distribution of competences. What is not clearly expressed of responsibility of the states is the responsibility of the government. As there is not a possibility to forbid, the states cannot forbid to establish the final destination of the waste, the responsibility should be of the federation. This lawsuit that has destroyed this action, we have the power of the consumer, the Greenpeace, always important, that are giving support to the Colectiva Malditos Plásticos, and we wanted to change. We had a litigation to change the situation. We thought about what we could do without thinking of what we could do, that this competence should go back to the states. We were discussing with the Supreme Court. We talked about with the National Congress, if it is the National Congress that should forbid. We observed that they were not open to that. And in February 23, we have presented this demand because they were omitted about these points. In human rights, they can be of individuals or legal entities, and in addition to that, we can defend legitimate rights by the associations, environmental associations. It's quite clear these legitimate states to defend the possibility of having a healthy environment. We had this lawsuit, also a lawsuit against the Congress, and we have said you were very silent, you have omitted to forbid the use of single-use plastics. This final decision was learned by the judicial power in Mexico. We have a Supreme Court of Justice in Mexico. Of course, we have other competencies of these courts, that they are final instances of final spheres. decision was sent in August 24. It was acknowledged that the Congress, they omitted this according to what they should. They did not legislate it about plastics. What was the strategy that we have used in this case? What do we believe that can be replicated in other countries, or that they be used as an example to other efforts in other countries? For sure, we have a national context that was very favorable in this litigation. It was very much studied. There was a strategy to present this lawsuit. We had a general constitution of the Republic since 1999. We have constitutional reform that offers the right to have a good environment, to health. Some countries, this right is not recognized constitutionally since 1999. It is said, it is established that the national development should be guided by a sustainability mandate. The first decade, the first actually 15 years of this century, these norms, they were only written in paper. But since 27, the second favorable element in this national context comes up because the Supreme Court starts to adopt precedents and sentences that are favorable to health environment. Since 2017 up to now, the right to a health environment is one of the most important advances that we have had. There is a broad interest of the communities of people, the right of the communities and people organizations that is defended as well. This right, it was established the possibility to adopt injunctions avoiding the harm to the environment. We also have pro natura law, and we also have a public hearing in 23 in the acknowledgement of the Inter-American human rights that notify that we should protect the environment and having the right to a health environment. The third treaty has to do that are signed about human rights, that all of that was used in this litigation. In addition to all of that, Mexico has signed this Escazú agreement since 2021. It's a norm that is part of our legal ruling, and it takes on a high importance in our state of law. This litigation brought something that is very simple and replicable anywhere in the world. Mexico should adopt legislative measures that should be respected and guaranteed the human rights that are recognized in different commitments, international, and the principles of human rights, international pacts, and these clauses. All these measures should be adopted. That's the first element of this strategy. The second one is this right to adopt legislative measures. They should be abided immediately. It's part of the human rights of committee since 31. We should have this structure, this framework, that in all these details of these treaties, these commitments, it was something that the judicial power did not have a specific power, that they should not act immediately. Where did this duty came up? After the reporting of toxicity of these products.
Los plásticos y los plásticos de un solo uso son sustancias peligrosas desde el momento en que se crean.
Since the moment that in which it's created, that affects the human rights, the states have the duty to adopt legislative measures to do things about that, according to the mandate of preventing exposure to toxic chemicals. After this acknowledgement, what is said is that the Congress of Mexico should have the obligation to legislate to forbid the use of single-use plastics. Today, there was a judgment, firstly in the first instance, and it was said that it was not a mandatory obligation, and there was a favorable element nationwide. There were lots of precedents of the Supreme Court, pardon, of the courts that helped us to change this decision. This Justice Court, they already demanded the omissions, legislative omissions many years ago. It was very clear in the case of legislate, not only the constitutional text, but as well the commitments of the international obligations. That is what we have presented. We also presented all of that. We also presented an injunction that looked for this another bill to forbid these plastics of single use. Well, it was recognized the obligation by the Congress to inform and conduct actions. After that, this measure took place in July 2024, and after 45 days, they have issued the final sentence by the court that has supported our actions and said that there was a legislative omission, that there was an obligation of those to legislate according to all the international commitments of the country to support the rights to health environment. The Congress, they did not abide to that, and they should abide. The effects were not expected, but actually they were kind of light. They should start actions that can lead to this prohibition and should be understood in a more favorable way, as it is established in the Mexican Constitution. And the organizations should be informed and should render information about all of that. We are now in the first instance. The court of the first instance is in charge, is responsible to abide by this law. They have 3 months to inform about that, and what we expect now is to go on, to move on with this struggle, these difficulties, but we cannot omit ourselves. We cannot be silent. The reforms do not showcase a good landscape. Regardless of that, the Congress should legislate, and if the sentence was not respected, there are lots of responsibilities. If the legislative power is not independent, as we won't have after September 1st, we will have a Congress that is acceptable, accept everything, that is not going to mandate on that. We will have to keep on working in parallel, because that's about the people of this country. We are now in the situation. If you have doubt, if you want to ask questions or remarks, I'm here to help you.
Vamos então passar à última parte deste webinar.
We are going to move on into the last part of this presentation. We are going to start with a question for Tatiana. It's a question that is in Spanish that will be used. Oh, sorry. What is the technology that is going to be used afterwards for you, Tatiana? Maybe I didn't understand it correctly. What is the technology that is going to be used for packagings? Oh, I got it now. Well, the proper discharging of packaging is presented by the person that will that is producing that material is a private obligation of those that uses or that sells that packaging. We can have different solutions. If we think in the obligation of the state in Brazil, we have many possibilities of discharging this material, mainly sorting out, not producing waste, what we call selective collection of material. Also, in the case of landfills, maybe you have tried all the possibilities with the proper discharging of that material before going, of not forming the
Muito obrigada.
waste.
Temos
Thank you.
agora comentário no chat em espanhol que diz:
There is a comment
"Algún día
here as
quería ser
well.
un académico ambiental. Me dijo que era indiscutible que los plásticos llegaran para
It's
quedarse.
an
Y todo apunta a que así será.
environmental
¿Cómo salir de esta enorme
professor.
contaminación?"
It says that
creo
all
que
indicates
ya
this
respondemos
situation.
un poco
How can we get out of
que
this
será
high
también por esta vía
contamination? I
judicial.
think
No
we
sé si
have
Luis
answered you
Miguel
already,
está
because
querer
it's going to be
contar.
through this judicial possibilities or judicial path.
Claro, con independencia de que mis colegas de la colectiva lo respondan desde otra óptica, a mí también me tocó estar
Regardless
en
of
un
the
foro
fact
académico
that
donde se
somebody
revisaban las
answers that,
principales
I
resoluciones
was
de
part of academic forum that we have talked about the main resolution of the courts in 2023. So one academic, he said that the first destination of plastic, that we have to separate, we have to understand.
Empiezan a generalizar y dicen, imaginen estar sin plásticos, volvemos a la época.
Maybe you can generalize, maybe we won't have plastic, you're gonna go back to the Stone Age, for example. Well, that's something completely wrong. Plastics, they are present today. Lots of plastics, they be very impactful. In the first step that we are giving today to judicialize are those that are dirty. Since the time that they are produced, that they contaminate, that they are incinerated, they present contamination. When they are incinerated, there are lots of impacts on our health. They are not necessary. They are not necessarily. The more marketing that we do, they should be forbidden, because they are very hazardous for the planet, for the environment, on animals, and those that we share the planet with, and our health, and also of the future generations. Thank you very much for your answers. We're talking here mainly about single-use plastics. Maybe Marisa wants to speak up as well. Well, Luis Miguel has spoken very clearly. We are focusing now on single-use plastic, because they represent the plastic contamination. Facing all of that, facing this scenario, we've got to start eliminating this 50%. Mexico has a major challenge, because there is a love for hydrocarbonates. If we do not reduce them, the production of that, if we do not reduce the single-use plastic, what are you going to do? As Luis Miguel said, is what is not necessary, what is not useful, what only brings somehow kind of comfort for people, but brings many other things. Of course, it's not going to disappear from one day to another. We don't want to go back to the cave, but having mountains and skies cleaner than what we have today. We're going to work in this direction. So the plastics of single use should be eliminated, in my opinion. Jose Manuel wants to speak up as well. Well, I think it's very important. It's a great step. It's very important to act on the single-use plastics. I'd like to recall the words that we said before. We are breathing, we are eating plastics, global wide, if we do not stop right away, if the lives do not prevail on that, the future of mankind won't have any solution. What we want to do what we're doing is to recycle toxic additives. What we have to understand is to make money or to be healthy. That's the main discussion. That's the core discussion that we should have here. And those that represent all of that they should ponder on these subjects.
Que diz how effective is positive legislation actually at this moment, along with the other civil movements, in challenging environmental racism in Mexico and throughout Latin America? Acho que a pergunta é dirigida a alguém da coletiva. Sintam-se à vontade para responder.
Si me permiten, mis colegas de la colectiva, yo empezaré diciendo que el siguiente.
If you don't mind me answering, I think you should think strategically, because we should forbid the imports of this plastic. We already were successful in our action, in our lawsuit. So if we start forbidding the single-use plastics, it's a beginning, and then we should move into the next steps, that is to accept imports of plastic. We are not a garbage country. We should not accept the garbage of other countries. We are going to keep on contaminating other countries, and I can put pressure on the other countries because of my strategic and military power, and they will be our big garbage. They will be our shanty towns. We all know that people that pay the high cost are not those that contaminate the most. Actually, are those that pay more, that pay higher price as well. We should have correct support and fight for them and forbid the imports of this material. Thank you very much. There is a new initiative. I'm going to give the floor to Fernanda Benzon. I'm going to add to Luis Miguel what he has talked about, the non-necessary waste. When the industry produces, for example, plastic cups, plastic plates, if there is other options, for example, we are somehow imposing what is cheaper. Any kind of plastic cutlery that it's produced, we are imposing on people, because sometimes the legislation is not updated, cannot deal with this kind of wastes. So I think that when I have spoken about Luxembourg, I was there last year with lots of activists, and it drew my attention that I didn't see any plastic bottle anywhere, no plastic cutlery, lots of things made out of wood and glass. So in the countries that I've been in which the legislation is more advanced, there is this kind of wastes are not generated. In Brazil and Mexico, our legislation is not well designed or properly designed, and because of that we keep on consuming this kind of waste. My question for Tatiana: what if this kind of waste that are not able to be recycled, they remain in the environment where the waste pickers are not able to sell this kind of materials that are not possible to be recycled? It's not part of the legislation. If there is any gap in our legislation because they do not include this kind of waste that are left someplace, and the companies also, they have the permission to produce this kind of packages. Okay, thank you, Fernanda. Well, waste that we have identified, we have observed some issues the places in which there are this kind of cooperatives, they are not able to somehow use or recycle that kind of waste. It could be recyclable, but as there is no market, it becomes a waste. There are plastics that are not possible to be recyclable because it would be very expensive, and also because of their material that is used or their characteristics. And so we have identified that this is the most complicated cases. If there is no possibility to be recyclable, it should not be produced, for example. That's a very emblematic point. There are certain packages that are produced with certain kinds or typology of plastics that make it difficult to be recycled. So sometimes that cooperative is not able to sell that material, that plastic. But it's not the cooperative that should be blamed. Those that should discharge properly the waste, their package, they should strengthen, stimulate the market to buy that waste, should also stimulate the logistics, think about the solution so that waste is not discharged in landfills. So I think that there are multiple solutions, amongst them the destination of specific kinds of packages.
Muito bem. Temos mais perguntas no chat. Acho que vamos partir para as
We have
últimas.
more
Temos
questions.
agora, diz, está em espanhol.
It's in
Como
Spanish.
combatir el colonialismo
How
tóxico
to
a nível
fight
municipal en México?
against the
Acciones o qué
toxic
sugerencias
colonialism
tienen ustedes como expertos en el tema?
citywide in Mexico. What actions that you can indicate being experts in the subject? Well, we, as I have said before, and Luis Miguel has said, he's an attorney, one of the possibilities that we have is to forbid the imports of these goods, or these plastics actually. And we didn't have a proper answer on how to curb the imports of this plastic, but we're going to keep on struggling, looking for this outcome. There is a problem that I had said before, what we call energy policy that is fostered in Mexico of hydrocarbons. So what is necessary to do in the states, as it was said by Luis Miguel, most states in Mexico, they already had prepared legislation against single-use plastics. What we're trying to do is that the states have the possibility to update this information and to strengthen the legislation against the use of single-use plastics. Our coalition, we are all the time working, fighting against the incineration of plastics, burning plastics and solid wastes as well. Also, the cement industry, we have to fight against this policy that somehow we strengthen the use of that plastics are burned, and the states should have the possibility to protect their own environment. So we are working, having this national vision, and we are following the international vision to forbid the imports of plastics. And we have maintained talks with most plastics that come from Mexico come from California. There are we have people in California, friends in California, because they're working the legislation. They should eliminate from the legislation the importation, the import that is known or said as recyclable. We're working already in this legislation because national ones or international of the United States that say that export is not recycling. I think we should have a special highlight on that. Well,
Acho que nos dá bom mote para também entrarmos no
I
final do
think
webinar.
we are coming to an end of our webinar. We still have somebody here, Jose Manuel. He has raised his hand.
Sí, nada más
If
en
you want to
relación a
speak
esta
up.
última pregunta,
No,
es
it's
importante,
about
es muy importante
this
finalmente
last question that
lo que
was
podamos hacer
asked.
como sociedad
I
es
think it's
importante.
very
No
important
queda más.
to
Tratados
mention that
internacionales,
what we have to do as a society, whatever we can do is important. We have national treaties, national legislations that should be approved. We should have a strong society that is demanding, that should propose new legislations. Otherwise, it's going to be completely dead. If we do not have a proper legislation, very strict, that we abide by. We should have the participation of the societies in the states, nationwide, cities. All the communities that are affected are the last one that learn about these mega projects. The poor communities are the most impacted, and they are the last to get to know about what is happening and the exposure that they undergo. They should be better informed and demand measures.
A nivel de nuestra Constitución General de la República, los
In
municipios
our
tienen la función de
general constitution of the country, the municipalities, they should clean, collect, and transport the waste and treat the waste as well. In our country, in the governmental level, those that are closer to the population, because a sort of decentralization of the government, and there are political interests. What it should be done is to try to protect the population. The plastics, they end up being thrown in these landfills. If we, instead of doing business with these people, they should protect the population. They should have a legal opposition and avoid that all this garbage come to their territories. Before, there was a generalized organization strategy against all of that. If there is this kind of action, maybe we can obtain the prohibition of this plastic and the import of this plastic as well. Thank you very much. I'd like firstly to thank all the members of the collective and the IDC for excellent interventions that highlighted the impacts of plastics on human rights, demonstrating how this is a systematic problem around the world and how strategic litigation can be a tool to combat it, mainly those of single use. These cases show that it's important to have strategic litigation to combat it. This webinar will be available for that, and we hope that this helps for a more active society that is more active and participative, and that we can contribute for more cases such as this in other places of the world. This webinar is going to be made available for you in our website and also in the YouTube. That's the very first webinar that we have planned, so be connected to our networks. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you for spending your time with us and all the networks. Keep an eye in our informations in our LinkedIn page. Thank you very much.